Hello everyone, so today I'm going to talk about versioning in Sitecore. This is going to cover not only language versions and how to create a new language for your Sitecore instance and then how to create versions of that language, but also I'm going to talk about how to create multiple versions in one language and how to maintain that and comparing and removing and adding and all the options in that thing. There's a few things I won't cover. There's some configuration that you can do that will interact or change some of the ways that versioning works. For example, you can change the locking mechanisms of Sitecore. So if one user works on one thing, you can make it so it automatically locks the item or the version of the item and automatically disengages that lock when they save or leave that item. There's also item or settings that will automatically enable the creation of new versions on an item. This kind of goes into workflow a slight bit because if you have workflow enabled, which I believe in this instance of Sitecore, I actually have workflow enabled, but hopefully I won't have to kind of cover that part. At some point I'll talk about workflow and versioning of items and how that works and how the automation of when you change something that's in the final workflow state, how that automatically creates a version of the item that you're working on. Let's kind of go with the basics of Sitecore real quick. You probably already know that everything that you see inside this content tree over here on the left, I'm using the content editor by the way, all these items are items. But what you don't know is that you also have a version to every one of these items. So by default, you're probably going to be using the English version version 1 of this item, but you can start creating new versions of the item as well. It gets a little strange when you start doing that to templates and things like that. I would kind of avoid that, but when you're working out of the side of the content tree, it might be a good idea to automatically create new versions of items when you're making changes to it. That way, if you find that you made a change, you don't like that change, you want to go back to the previous version, you can actually go back to that previous version. One caveat that I will note here is that if you get too many versions to an item, especially if you have hundreds, if not thousands, of regular items in your tree, and then you have 10 versions plus for each of those items, you could be going down a bad path with that because you're basically 10 times 1,000 items and you have 10,000 items in your tree or 10,000 versions of items in your tree. So you might need to look at cleaning up older versions. So if you have 10 or more, you might want to say, I only want 10 versions of an item at a time and create an automated process. I believe there's one that's actually built into Sitecore, but it's not turned on by default to remove old versions of items. But if there isn't, I can't remember this for sure, you could always create one, a scheduled task that just runs and removes versions of items, the oldest version of an item, when there's 10 or more, or well, more than 10. So that would be my recommendation when you start getting into versioning, is that you have some way to remove old versions or archive old versions if you're going to want to keep some of that information. There is a product by Xcentium, I believe it's called Vault. This is where they've taken that product even further, or the default Sitecore provided functionality even further. They basically keep versions of every change that you make inside your content tree, and they keep this kind of information somewhere else, so that that way it's not really impacting your Sitecore instance, but you're able to access all of this versioned data about your content items that you can restore at any point. So the great thing about that is one thing I see a lot in production environments is that one content editor decides he's going to change something. He might not even be aware he's changing something, and he's deleted something that he shouldn't have, renamed it or something along those lines that's hard to restore. If you don't have versions of those items, obviously it's a little harder to get back. You can maybe use your database backups to get that information back, but it's not as easy unless you are using something like Xcentium's Vault. That would be really easy to restore your data. So if you're working on something that you really need to have versions and you need to have lots of like history of those items and the versions of those items, then I would look at something like Xcentium's Vault for that solution. Obviously, that's a different license, so I'm not necessarily condoning it because it's an additional license that you have to purchase. But if you need that kind of level of versioning control and history, then that would be the best solution for that. You can set up Sitecore to do something similar to that, but then you're getting tons of versions in your content tree, and then you have to look at how do you remove those or delete those or archive them or whatever it may be, because if you're not, then you're going to run into performance issues in your content tree down the road and even potentially your public facing website. Anyways, so let's get started. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play around with versioning of my blog articles. I'm using my example 8.2 instance that I've used for other tutorials in the past. So let's go ahead and I'm going to start out by creating a new language. So this will go into half of what I'm going to be talking about, which is language versions, which is a whole nother concept. So you might have versions of items in English, but let's say you wanted to create a Spanish version of that item. Now, obviously, by default, this wouldn't show up unless you specified and resolve the language as Spanish to the language resolver, which is basically Sitecore's implementation that determines what language should it pull that item or your page in. That kind of goes into language fallback, which I will talk about in a later session about how language fallback works with 8.1 and beyond. I'm not going to talk about 8.0 and below because that didn't have a language fallback feature and you would have to custom write your own. So I'm not going to go into that because that's more complicated. I may cover how you might want to create one in the future if you're running on a version like that, but I would, in that instance, recommend upgrading your version. Let's go ahead and get deep dive into this. So I'm going to create a new version. I'm just going to create a Spanish version. So to create a new language, you'd go into System, which is underneath the main root is all the system, social, media library, etc. Underneath System is Languages, and then if you right click and do Insert, and then select language, then you can start defining a language that you want to use. There's predefined ones. These kind of revolve around the .NET languages. So if you had something that you wanted to create that was outside of this, you can define new .NET languages, but you also have to install them on your Windows operating system, whatever that may be, Windows Server 2012 or whatever version of Windows Server that you're using. You need to resolve those or create those languages since they're new .NET languages on that server. I would recommend not going down that route if you can avoid it, but there are some scenarios that have had that scenario. So for example, if you're trying to build a European Union language, for example, to cover all English across the European Union, that whole region, then you might need to create something new. I'm just going to assume that we're creating a Spanish version. I'm going to select, as you can see, there's multiple types of Spanish. If you are in Ecuador, you might have a specific language of Spanish for Ecuador, or you might have one for Honduras or Mexican or Puerto Rican, etc. I'm just going to select the Spain International Sort, meaning kind of like the default one. Let me select. There you go. You can define a custom code, but you don't need to. Basically, it's going to take the language code versus the country code and create an ES dash. So I'm going to go next, and it's just this information doesn't really matter. This is more information for the language, etc. So basically, what it's done is created ES. This is the language, and then there's the country region code. If you want an ES US, so Spanish, the Spanish language in US, you would define one here. However, at the end it will tell you that you can't create that just because that's not already predefined. So, all right, so I've created this language, and right now the languages all have not really great logos. I like to give these, or icons is actually what I should have said. I like to give these icons something that represent the language. So I would actually change these to the Spanish flag, for example, for Spanish. So if you go over icons and you select the drop down, there should be flags here, and then you can find one that represents Spanish. Looking for Spain as my option. Actually, it's probably this. Yeah. So I knew it. I just had forgotten what it was. So I just select Spain. This not isn't technically Spain, but it's a flag that represents Spanish. And in English, sometimes I'll actually create it as also change the icon. It's a protected item, so you can unprotect. If I was an administrator, keep in mind I am logged in as an administrator, as you can see up here. You can actually unprotect items and start making changes to them. Obviously, you do not want to accidentally delete your EN version, language version, because that would delete, or, well, when you delete a language version or a language item, like the English item, it won't actually delete all the language versions for every item in your content tree. It's going to leave them there, but there's going to be no way to load that content, even select that content to be in fact. So just keep that in mind. Icons, this one, I will just make it US. That one should be easier to find. If I live in the US. If you didn't know that, now you do. Now I've created all the language versions. I have two, or let me rephrase that. I have two languages defined. I have English and I have ES, which is Spanish. Well, Spanish language in general, Espanol, which is ES. Or that's the region that it specifies. So it's generic, it's Spanish. Anyways, so let's go over to Acme A. And this is now a content item. So to start working with versions, there's several different ways, and that's a kind of a theme for Sitecore in general. The first is you have these options up here on the right. So you have, as you can see, this one actually already has, in the English language, they have 3 versions already for this item, and you can select this button and see the 3 different versions. You can even go ahead and add a new version for the English language as well. And lastly, you can also select here, and now you can see based off your language definitions inside that languages folder in the system area where I just created that new language, it's pulling in and saying, okay, I have these 2 languages. You can actually get language versions for other languages and even create language versions for the French Belgium if you wanted to. But there's going to be no way to pull this into your site. So keep that in mind. So I could create a new version, French Belgium, but there's no languages, so therefore there's really no reason to do this. As you see, there's nothing selected. So I'm going to go ahead and select Spanish or Spain, and then you're gonna see that there is no, because there's no versions of that item, there's no selector to select or change the versions over here. But you will have this message that says add a new version for this item. Next also is there's a versions tab up here along the top, assuming you have the right permissions to add this or see this tab. Not all content editors can see the tab, but I would say majority of them can. In here is you're going to see all types of things related to versions of items. So first you can select the versions dropdown. This will show you your versions of this current item in the current language. As you can see, there's no versions because, like I said, no one's added a version of this language yet. Next will be an option to add a version. And then you can see behind the scenes also, there's grayed out options here. These are options to remove versions and compare, which I'll show this here shortly. Obviously, they're grayed out because I don't have a version to this item yet. You can also change the language. So I can change this from Spanish or I can change the language and change this from Spanish to English. And now I'm working with English versions. So I can now see I have the option to remove. I can remove all versions, or I can remove just the current version, which the current version relates to what is selected here. So this shows that this is highlighted. And so this is highlighted. So this is a current working version that I'm working with. And then I can always change and go down to 1, for example. Because workflow is enabled, you're going to see some other boxes here. One saying that if you publish now, the selected version will not be visible on the website because it has been replaced by a newer version. If you create a newer version and you don't have workflow, I'm pretty sure the new version would get published and the older version would not. So it's based off the newest version that is ready for being published. So if you had workflow enabled, you could create 5 versions of an item. If they're not in that final workflow state, the sixth option, the one that's furthest back, that is in final workflow state, will be published. But since I'm assuming you don't have workflow enabled, but if you do, you would just create a new version, and that version of that item would get published. So keep that in mind, and keep in mind that other people can publish the content tree as well. So if you create a new version, your version could accidentally get published without you wanting it to. There is a concept of locking, which I will briefly. We'll kind of look at this further with related to workflow, the whole concept of locking versus not locking. But anyways, let's go into versioning. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new version of the Spanish item. So if I go ahead and click Add New Version, which you could have done it this way, or you could have gone through Add. Either way, it would have been the same outcome. And it's basically saying if you publish now, the second version will not be publishable or visible on the site related to workflow. This is just because of workflow. If you didn't have workflow enabled, then this would automatically get published, like I said. So I'm going to just change it to approved. As an administrator, I have the ability to change workflow states as however I want them to be changed. So now what I can do is there's a few options. There's two different options. You can compare items between versions. I'm not going to show that one yet. I'm going to do that with the English versions of the site because they have multiple versions. But there is the ability to translate from one language to another. So if you wanted to, since I'm creating a new Spanish version of this item, I can actually click the translate button, and now it shows basically on the right is the English version, and on the left is the new version, which is the Spanish version that I'm creating. So if I wanted to, now I could go through, read what's going on here on the right, and translate that over here on the left. And keep in mind you can change this to different things if you wanted to as well. So if you had a lot of different things up, if you had lots of different languages, let's say a Dutch version or a French version, you can translate from your Dutch to your Spanish, for example. And you can also compare your versions of each one. Got selected up here. It looked like a little bug because it said US was selected or English was selected by, actually Spanish was selected by default. But when I click translate, it actually loaded the US version over here. If I click back to English, you'll see that the English version is what actually displayed. And you can change this. So I could say latest, which is the current version of, it's kind of acting kind of funny, but I can change this to version 2 of this item versus version 1, which I'm currently working on for the Spanish language. I don't know Spanish, so I can't really do this perfectly, but I can just go ahead and save this, and now I have different content for my Spanish versus my. So now that that's defined, let's just turn off the translate feature. All you have to do is click this translate button, and then it's back to just having one version selected. So I have the Spanish version of version 1 of the Spanish version selected and open. I've saved that change, so all is good here. Lastly, let's just cover comparing versions, let's not just compare language versions, but also just versions between a language. So I go back to English. I'm just going to change this to version 2. And I'm just going to quickly change some things. And show you how powerful this feature is. So I've made all the changes to this version 2 of this item, of the English version, or English language version 2. So now if I go back to version 3, which is the newest version, you'll notice that all the content is kind of changed. It doesn't have all the content I was changing in version 2. But let's kind of compare these. Let's see what the difference is. So you can actually compare and see the difference between version 3 and version 2, and it will actually cross out, or it will even highlight things that are added. Let me show that real quick as well. So I'm going to add, this is version 3 I'm changing. So now if I click compare, it's going to show that between 2 and 3, I deleted the word now as it's crossed out in this, and then the text is highlighted for anything that was added. So I didn't add anything else. I mostly just deleted things. But now this is an opportunity for you to, go through, see what the differences are, and you can start making, getting more knowledge about what has changed and what hasn't. And here's another, if you do 2 column, you can actually see side by side the differences, whereas the 1 column basically just takes all the information, compares it, and builds a representation of that information into a 1 column view. So it's a pretty cool feature. It allows you to, especially if you start adding a lot of versions between items and you just want to see, okay, John Smith, he changed the short description to be this information and it was previously that. Okay, well, that was by mistake, so let's go in and fix that real quick. That's pretty much it for this tutorial. Lastly, we can remove, if you have a version selected, let's say version 3, it can be any of these versions, even versions in the past, you can click on the remove option and it will delete that option. Keep in mind it's deleting that version of this language. So keep in mind that you need to still do a publish to get that out of your content, out of your website. So if you deleted version 1, for example, or you added a new version and you deleted it, you still should do a publish after you're done. Lastly, you could theoretically remove all versions. That's going to basically take English back down to 0 versions available, and you would have to create new versions. This seems like a pretty powerful feature, so you may want to restrict access to this because there's really no going back once you do this. It's not going to move this information anywhere. It's going to literally delete it, which then it's hard to get it back. So just keep in mind that you might want to restrict that to maybe an administrator or super users or something, some extremely elevated user that should only have that ability in rare situations. Keep that in mind. There is the ability to reset fields. This isn't necessarily related to versions. This is comparing your information versus the standard values of this template. So blog template or article template, I think it's actually called. If I wanted to change this title back, and it's only changing it for the current version of this item. So if I reset, it's now showing name, which is just taking it back to the token value that we created originally or used originally in the standard values. Keep that in mind. You don't really need that. If you go back to version 2, you'll see that it's back to the right text. So if you at any point want to just reset a field back to a original value, especially if you're using not necessarily content items, but maybe some sort of lookup item or something like that, where you're defaulting it to some sort of specific text and you just want to reset it back to that original value, you can definitely do that. Another example, we've done this a lot with images. We have kind of placeholder images that we use across the site. If we want to, if you have that defined in an image field, I don't actually have any for this item, I probably should. If you've in the standard values, it's kind of commonplace to set a placeholder image that would be the default image for any image that does not have an image. So if you define a new image for this article, then if you reset and you press reset on the field, it will set it back to the standard values, which means it will go back to the default value of that for the standard values, which is probably what you want in this situation, instead of having to go and find out that item that's the default value and set it back up. So that's pretty much it for versions and language versions. Like I said, there's a kind of correlation between versioning and workflow. I'm not going to discuss that in this tutorial. I'm probably going to at some point talk about how to create the automated process to either if it's a setting in Sitecore or if I have to build something custom for this to automatically remove versions when you reach a certain amount. I will get back to you guys on that one, either doing a session on, like I said, customizing it or just configuring it, or covering those automatic publishing options. Because I know you can also, I know out of the box you can publish items by default at a certain interval. That one is built in. So yeah. All right. If you have any questions about this, please feel free to reach out to me. Refer to my LinkedIn and my Twitter below, and reach out to me if you have any questions about any of this, or leave a comment. I really find it very helpful for the community as they watch these videos to also leave comments, and then I will answer your comments, especially if you have questions about anything that was covered in this session. All right. Thank you.